Good afternoon, I'm Abe, and this is Frank, and today we're adumbrating the second half of Chapter 9, launching the new ship of state in Kennedy, Cohen, and Bailey's The American Pageant textbook. So let's get started.
Tell me, Abe, how did the French Revolution affect the United States of America?
Alright, so near the end of Washington's first term, the stage was set because in 1793, two political parties had evolved. One, the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, and two, the Hamiltonian Federalists. However, as Frank was just saying, the French Revolution sent tremors throughout the Western world. At first, the American people were overjoyed with the French Revolution, since the initial stages of the Revolution were not unlike America's own dethroning of Britain. Only a few ultra-conservative Federalists were against the despicable mobocracy and revolt. And when the French declared war on Austria and repelled the Austrian armies and proclaimed itself a republic, Americans sang French revolutionary songs along with the French and renamed various streets and places like Liberty Lane and Equality Lane and Liberty Street. After the revolution turned bloody and radical, however, the Federalists apprehensively eyed the Jeffersonians, who regretted the bloodshed but felt that no revolution could be carried out without at least some bloodshed. Still, neither the Federalists or the Jeffersonians completely approved of the French Revolution. America was sucked into the revolution when France declared war on Great Britain and the watery duel for the Atlantic began again. So, Frank, why did the Americans choose to stay neutral and not join either side of the French Revolution?
Well, Abe, this is where we see the two-party politics in America begin to have a good effect. We have the two different parties, the Jefferson Democratic Republicans, we'll just call them the Jeffersonians, and the Hamiltonian Federalist Party. And they both have different ideas about where America should act and how it should act. So the Jeffersonians want to enter on the side of France, since France was the recent friend of the U.S. during the Revolutionary War. But the Hamiltonians lean towards siding with the British, because doing so would be economically helpful for the American colonies. Washington knew that war would mean disaster for the U.S. The U.S. didn't have enough money, it didn't have the military to fight either France or Britain, who are still at this time superpowers. So, in 1793, he issues the Neutrality Proclamation, proclaiming the U.S.'s official neutrality and warning Americans to stay out of the issue and be impartial. Now, Jeffersonians were furious since they wanted to join and help the French. And the French and British weren't that happy either, since they felt that the Americans owed them some help. Soon afterwards, French emissary Edmond Guenet arrived in South Carolina as a representative of France to the U.S. On his trip to Philadelphia, he came wrongly to believe that Washington's Neutrality Proclamation didn't truly reflect the feelings of the Americans, and he started to equip privateers to plunder the British ships, and he started to equip troops to invade Spanish Florida and British Canada. He went as far as to threaten to appeal over the head of Washington to the sovereign voters, and which resulted in his expulsion from the country. However, he's a good example of how far France and England were willing to go to gain America's alliance. So tell me, Abe, what led the United States of America, once again, to the brink of war with England?
Alright, so the British still had many posts in the Americas, and the British supplied the Indians with weapons. Little Turtle, the Miami tribe war chief, led his army to defeat the American generals Josiah Harmer and Arthur St. Clair. However, the American general Mad Anthony Wayne crushed the Miamis at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. In the subsequent Treaty of Greenville, the Indian Confederacy gave up much of the Old Northwest to the Americans. But instead, they received 1, monetary recompensation, 2, the right to hunt in the land that they ceded, and 3, an overall recognition of their sovereign status. In the Battle of Fallen Timbers, however, the Americans realized and were infuriated by the fact that the British were supplying guns to the Indians. The overall British goal was to starve out the French West Indies. Remember, they were in war with the French. And they ignored the Americans' neutrality, and British commanders seized about 300 American merchant ships and then took those American seamen and put them into their own British army. So this led to many of the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans crying out for war with Britain, or at least some sort of an embargo or a halting of trade. But Washington refused because he knew that such a type of drastic action would destroy trade with Britain and therefore destroy the Hamiltonian financial system. However, Frank, what ultimately led America to avoid war with Britain once again?
Well, luckily, in a last-ditch effort to avoid war, Washington sends negotiator John Jay to England to negotiate a deal. However, John Jay's negotiating and dealing was sabotaged right off the bat by Hamilton, who secretly gave the British the details of Americans' bargaining strategy. As a result, the results of Jay's treaty weren't good for America. Britain would repay the lost money from recent ship seizures, called impressment, but it also avoided promising to stop arming the Indians and promising to not impress and seize more ships. America would also have to pay off its pre-Revolutionary War debts to England. As a result, the Jeffersonians from the South were furious, as most of the farmers in the South realized that they would have to pay up taxes to pay off the debt, while the merchants in the North would actually be gaining money because their ships would be being paid for by Great Britain. On the bright side, war was avoided, however, and also as a side effect, in response, Spain, worried about an American-British alliance, created the Pinckney Treaty of 1795, in which Spain gave Americans free navigation of the Mississippi and a large disputed territory north of Florida. So that was another indirect boon of Jay's treaty. After his second term, Washington decided voluntarily to step down, creating a strong precedent for only 2 terms, which would last until FDR hundreds of years later. In his farewell address to the nation, Washington warned first against political parties, which had formed during his reign in office, and secondly, against permanent treaties and alliances with foreign nations. When we look back at Washington's legacy, we can see that he set the U.S. on the path to success. Ironically, America ended up being more helpful to France as a neutral ally anyway, since neutral American cargo ships could sail through the British blockade to equip and supply French forces and French citizens in their Caribbean colonies. Abe, can you inform me, who succeeded Washington as president of the U.S.?
So Hamilton was the logical choice to become the next president, but his financial plan had made him very unpopular. So John Adams, the ablest statesman of his day, won in the presidential election against Thomas Jefferson, who subsequently became vice president. Adams came off as a man who did his duties with stubborn devotion. Essentially, he was an intellectual aristocrat with no appeal to the masses, however. Adams also suffered from other handicaps. Hamilton hated him, and Hamilton plotted with Adams' own cabinet against the president. Adams also had a precarious situation with France that could easily explode into war. Now, Frank, could you tell me more about this situation with France?
Yeah, so France was furious about Jay's treaty for 2 main reasons. First, they saw it as depriving them of a potential ally, that of the U.S., and secondly, they called it a flagrant violation of the 1778 Franco-American Treaty. And as a result, they began seizing defenseless American merchant ships. In the XYZ affair, a few months later, John Adams sent 3 envoys to France, including John Marshall, where they could work out a deal to stop this seizing of ships. They were approached by 3 French agents, X, Y, and Z, who demanded massive amounts of money, 32 million florins and $250,000 worth of bribes just for talking with French leader Talleyrand. Now, this was clearly too much money for the infant nation of the United States, and the envoys returned to America, cheered by the angry Americans as having done the right thing for their country. Some Americans even called for war with France, but Adams, being intelligent as Washington, decided to remain neutral. Some Americans, after having called for war, carried out an undeclared war against France, which was confined mostly to the seas. Therefore, a war on the seas raged for 2.5 years, where American ships captured over 80 armed French ships, and French retaliated, but only on the seas. Abe, can you inform me how Adams negotiated with the French?
Okay, so the French leader Charles Talleyrand knew that war with the U.S. would add another enemy to France's long list, and therefore declared that if another American envoy was sent to France, that it would be received with respect. John Adams knew that war must be avoided while the country was still weak, so he accepted. And in 1800, the three American envoys met with Napoleon, who was eager to work with the U.S. so that he could end the American squabble and therefore focus on furthering his empire elsewhere. In the Convention of 1800, which was signed in Paris, it was not a convention but a treaty, it ended the American alliance with France in return for the United States paying the American shipper damage claims. In keeping the U.S. at peace, John Adams plunged his own popularity and therefore lost his chance at a possible second term of presidency. But overall, it is seen that he did the right thing, and he kept the new U.S. neutral while it was weak to preserve the nation. So, Frank, could you tell me what were some of the illiberal laws that the Federalists passed?
Yeah, so the Federalist Party were traditionally known for kind of scorning the poorer end of society, which were in turn embraced by the Jeffersonians, or JDRs. With the alien laws, the Federalists raised the residence requirements for aliens who wanted to become citizens from 5 to 14 years of residence, a law that violated the U.S.'s tradition of assimilation and hospitality towards those who came to our shores. Another law let the president deport or jail dangerous aliens during peace times or times of war. The Sedition Act stated that anyone who impeded the policies of the government, no matter which laws they were, liberal or illiberal, anyone who violated the policies of the government or falsely defamed its officials, including the president, would be liable to a heavy fine and imprisonment. It was aimed at newspaper editors and Jeffersonians during its reign, and it was also conveniently written to expire in 1801 to prevent the use of it against themselves. Furthermore, in the elections of 1798 to 99, the Federalists won the most sweeping vote in the history of the country. Abe, can you inform me how Madison and Jefferson responded to the Alien and Sedition Acts?
Okay, so these resentful Jeffersonians refused to accept the Alien Laws and the Sedition Act, and Jefferson feared that the Federalists, after having wiped out the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press, they feared that the Federalists might violate other natural rights. Overall, both Jefferson and Madison stressed the compact theory, which essentially meant that the 13 sovereign states, in creating the federal government, had entered into a compact or a contract regarding the government's jurisdiction. The individual states were the final judges of whether their agent had broken the compact by overstepping the authority. So overall, they stress this compact theory of government in which the states had the right to nullify the federal laws. Overall, the Virginia and the Kentucky Resolution set out to kill the sedition and the alien laws, and also the resolutions were basically campaign documents designed to crystallize opposition to the Federalist Party and to unseat it in the upcoming presidential election. However, only Virginia and Kentucky adopted these laws, and Federalists argue that the people, not the states, had made the contract, and it was ultimately up to the Supreme Court to nullify the legislation, so they were kind of against this. So neither Madison or Jefferson in the end wanted secession, but they did want to end the Federalist abuses and were willing to go to lengths to end those abuses. Now, so Frank, how were the Federalists pitted against the Democratic Republicans?
Yeah, so this section, it's the final section. It's basically just summarizing the viewpoints of the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. So we'll start with the Federalists. They wanted a strong central government ruled by educated aristocrats, not commoners. They believed that educated aristocrats, the wealthy, were the best people to rule. Most of them were merchants, manufacturers, shippers along the Atlantic seaboards, or the wealthy upper class. They were mostly pro-British and recognized that foreign trade was the key to economic stability and independence from foreign commercial outputs. However, on the other side of the aisle were the Democratic Republicans. Republicans were led at this time by brilliant speaker Thomas Jefferson, who, though a poor orator, was a great leader and an appealer to the common people. They desired rule by informed classes and a weaker central government that would preserve the sovereignty of the states. They were mostly pro-French. Jefferson was rich and even owned slaves, but he managed to appeal to the common people, unlike the Federalists. They emphasized that the national debt had to be paid off, and they were mostly farmers and insisted on no privileges for the upper classes, unlike the Federalists. having advocated rule of the people, but not all the people, just those who weren't ignorant. That's what Jefferson viewed, and he also championed free speech and slavery, arguing that slavery could help avoid a class of landless voters by providing the necessary labor. Thus, as 1800 rolled around, the disunity in America between the two parties was as prominent as ever.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.
Comment if you have any questions, and we'll catch you guys next time.